Good evening, good afternoon, good morning to all of you tuning in from around the world. I hope you're all staying happy and healthy. Thank you for joining us for what is set to be an extraordinary event. A journey to the heart of the universe with neuroscience, systems biology, astrophysics and philosophy are steps on the way. My name is Luke. I'm a producer here at How To Academy, and it is my privilege to introduce our incredible roster of speakers today. First, Dr. Iain McGilchrist, a psychiatrist, philosopher and literary scholar. He is a fellow of All Souls College, Oxford, a fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists and of the Royal Society of Arts, as well as a former clinical director of the Bethlem Royal and Maudsley Hospital. His previous book, The Master and His Emissary, reached international recognition and acclaim and has placed him as one of the greatest thinkers and philosophers of our time. Ian will be joined today by Dimitra Rigopoulou, Professor of Astrophysics at Oxford, a Senior Curti Fellow of Brasenose College, and a Senior Research Fellow at Lady Margaret Hall. Dimitra's research focuses on the physical mechanisms behind the processes that govern star formation in galaxies. She's actively involved in a number of ESA and NASA missions. Our third speaker today is a world-renowned physiologist, Denis Noble Cbe Frs. Denis held the Burden-Sanderson Chair of Cardiovascular Physiology at Oxford and was appointed Professor Emeritus and Co-Director of Computational Physiology. Professor Noble is one of the pioneers of systems biology and developed the first viable mathematical model of the working heart. He is one of the founders of the new field of systems biology and is the author of the first popular science book on the subject, The Music of Life. And finally, your moderator for this evening, Benedict Ratagan, is director of the Schweitzer Institute, a think tank that promotes an ethic of reverence for life through educational programs, community outreach projects, a peer-reviewed journal, and university conferences. He is also joint supervising editor with Denis Noble of Bisymmetrics, the Journal of Symmetry and Asymmetry. So after a 50-minute conversation, the panel will take questions from you, the audience, so please type any you have in the little Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and Benedict will get to them at the end. Well, that's more than enough from me, so without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Ian, Denis, Dimitra, and Benedict. Benedict, over to you.
Good evening, and welcome from Royal College, Oxford. I'm Benedict Ratagan. Aristotle came up with certain ideas, which turned out to be wrong. But Galileo and Newton fixed things up. Then Einstein came along and broke everything again. And today we've more or less got it all figured out, except for the big stuff, the small stuff, the hot stuff, the cold stuff, and the dark stuff. So this evening I'm joined by three distinguished guests, and we're going to see if we can make some sense of this chaos. Now, symmetry is a profoundly important principle. It's central to mathematics, and it's emerged as one of the most fundamental ideas in science, hidden at the heart of everything from quantum mechanics to Einstein's theory of relativity. Now, Dimitra, the concept of symmetry is used in significantly different ways. In art, for example, good proportions are key. But what do physicists mean when they speak of symmetry?
Right, yeah, well, symmetry is fundamental, is central in physics in many ways. And it wasn't actually until the start of the 20th century that symmetry really became center stage. How do I describe symmetry in physics? Well, when we take an observation, there are sort of two parts, right? There are the conditions under which our experiment is carried out, which are unpredictable. And then there are the laws that underline a said experiment. And symmetry is there so that the laws are invariant. So irrespective of what the observations, the initial conditions do, we know we will get said observations because the underlying laws remain invariant. So that's sort of central to what we think symmetry is, to what how we experience symmetry in physics. In classical mechanics, for instance, symmetry is very sort of easily understood. If you say, well, I have an object that is moving from point A to point B, and irrespective of the conditions, this movement will always happen and it will be reversible in some sense. In quantum mechanics, this becomes a little bit more complicated because we have actually the concept of superpositions. So there it has become a little bit more complex, whereas a certain event can actually take place because you have a superposition of other events. I won't go into Hilbert spaces and so on, because it becomes a little bit more complicated. Then we have near symmetries, where something actually is not quite symmetric, but we can approximate that, and that's a near symmetry. So it will still hold, although the laws, the fundamental laws, might actually not be symmetric. Like you can get to the same event. Earlier I said that we get to the same event by various routes. Here you get sort of near similar routes, but overall it is a near symmetry. And then we have symmetry breaking, where again, that's another, where certain laws of nature are actually revealed to us because symmetries are broken.
Okay, and I suppose that in evolutionary terms, the reason why nature favors symmetry is because it's so much simpler, isn't it? It's been observed by Ian Johnson and Bilyeu and others that the algorithms to produce simple symmetric patterns are that much easier to embed in genetic code. I mean, as a geneticist, Denis, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think what is very interesting about what Dimitra has just said is the key, because you distinguished between the conditions and the laws, and the conditions are all over the place.
Absolutely.
Which is why we need the laws to understand anything at all. Now, in biology, that is the key to understanding why it cannot possibly be the case that a structured set of molecules like the genetic code can be the full cause of what happens to us, because those initial and boundary conditions, just to use the technical mathematical term for this, will be extraordinarily diverse. So organisms, it seems to me, live on the edge between order and disorder. They cannot be in any other state. And I'm afraid that biology got that wrong for roughly 80 years.
And we'll come on to that a little bit later,
Yes.
and talk about it in some more detail.
Yeah.
I want to thank you for your very succinct description of symmetry, Dimitra, but I'm not a scientist, but philosophy is concerned with the structure of ideas. And I'd suggest that our understanding of symmetry, of the structure of symmetry, is actually quite one-sided. A definition of balance is the presence of two equal but opposite principles. So on a set of weighing scales, for example, you get 2 pounds of equal weight set on opposite sides of a pivot, and there can be no balance without two complementary factors, equality and opposition. And a definition of symmetry is changes or transformations which leave an object unchanged, which, just like with balance, there's a correspondence of opposites at the very heart of symmetry. There's a sort of polarity, if you like. It's my belief, in fact, Denis and I have been working on a book together, The Language of Symmetry, which explores this idea. It's my belief that we've sort of looked at symmetry in terms of invariance and harmony and repetition, but we failed to take into account the conflict that lies at the heart of it. And that really is one thing I'd really like to focus on a little bit this evening. And this principle is in evidence throughout nature, this contradictory principle. Life simultaneously moves towards its own creation and destruction. The universal will to live constantly contradicts itself, because survival of life itself necessitates death. So at the origin of life itself, we find a coincidence of opposites. Now, Ian, in your book, in your first book, your classic book, The Master and His Emissary, you describe an interesting polarity which conditions how animals pay attention in order to survive in the wild, which has contradiction again very much at its heart. Could you explain that to us?
Well, yes, I wouldn't call it either a dipole or a symmetry, okay. But there are two quite distinct ways in which the hemispheres pay attention to the world, and this has survival value. The left hemisphere paying detailed attention to some small feature, very sharply defined, and the right hemisphere at the same time providing broad, open, vigilant attention without conception of what it is. So these are really rather different. And I noticed you mentioned, which is very close to my heart, the whole business of coincidence of opposites, and I have a whole chapter on it in my new book. I think it's a very important principle, but I don't think it's quite the same as the principle of symmetry. And in the human brain and in all the areas that I've looked at, asymmetry is very important. And you find Pasteur in the 1870s saying that there may be symmetries, but what really matters for life is asymmetry, and that's the origin of it. And then in the 1890s, you get Pierre Curie saying that much the same thing about the inanimate universe, that effectively there could be symmetries, but they really don't count. What matters is asymmetry. And I think asymmetry is what gives that forward movement that is creative, whereas symmetry tends to be static. And you said one, and it's quite true, one of the ways of defining symmetry is that an operation obeys symmetry if after the operation it remains unchanged. But what we're looking for is a principle of change.
Okay.
What I quite like to say about asymmetry is that it brings together order and disorder. You can't have asymmetry without the suggestion of symmetry. For example, the contents of the glove box in my car are not asymmetrical, they're just a mess. Not everything that is not symmetrical is asymmetrical. But in asymmetry, there is implied symmetry, and it's that tension or contrast between the asymmetry and the symmetry that seems to me important.
Okay, this idea of the coincidence of opposites, which you mentioned, I think is absolutely key to everyday life. It's not just something which applies in biology or genetics or physics or what have you.
No.
And perhaps we could just explore that for a moment. I mean, that freedom needs constraints, for example.
Exactly.
If you surrender them, you have either anarchy or slavery.
Yes,
And with rights, on the other hand, come responsibilities. So there are sort of symmetries of correspondences of opposites, which seems to inform our everyday lives to an extent perhaps that we haven't really fully recognized. Is that something you're aware of?
I think it's deeply important, and I think something that in our culture is really not been given enough value. That we seem to believe that something is good and that more and more and more of it is just better and better and better. But all my life, I've noticed that when you push things too far in one direction, you get the opposite. You just mentioned too much freedom, you've got a tyranny. And this business of the co-arising of opposites is something wonderful. I quite agree. Asymmetry is itself such a coincidence of order and disorder. And it's that coming together of order and disorder that is important for, possibly for existence, but certainly for life.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all agree there's an absolute, you and I agree, there's an absolute necessity of asymmetry in the universe. Balance needs to be constantly disturbed and restored. For example, symmetry breaking is fundamental to every physiological process. Without it, the universe would be static. I mean, that's the case, isn't it? But I'd suggest that the various forms of symmetry, whether it's symmetry in the fields of physics or genetics or neuroscience, they all in the end have to relate to one specific symmetry, which is the symmetry of symmetry and asymmetry. And whether or not asymmetry is predominant or symmetry is predominant, the fact is we need more than just symmetry alone. And we need more than just asymmetry alone, but it's the two taken together. The bit that scientists and philosophers routinely ignore, the point where symmetry and asymmetry meet, I think that's where it sort of all happens. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that it's very obvious that you will not get creativity, which is a fundamental feature of life in all its forms, whether you study a simple bacterium or whether you study the whole human being. Creativity and the invention of new ways of coping with the environment in which the organism finds itself is absolutely critical. You cannot get that out of a determinate algorithm. Now, one of the replies that some people will give to me when I make this point is, well, we can add a kind of random number generator to a determinate machine. But that doesn't get the point, because it is the use of the disorder at, say, a molecular level by the higher organization of our bodies that gives the possibility of creating ordered creativity. And that's going to be the key. Organisms are all the time pushing forwards, inching forwards, as it were, to find ways in which they can best survive in the environment they find themselves in, and incidentally, an environment created by organisms themselves. We shouldn't just distinguish between the organism and its environment. A lot of our environment is other organisms. Now, in all of that, the disorder that arises both at the molecular level from variation in what our molecules are doing, genes included, and certainly proteins, and the other kind of disorder which you were referring to earlier on, which is the conditions under which any laws will operate, because that's going to be the social context in which organisms exist. All of that melds together in a multi-level set of interactions. You cannot therefore talk about, oh, what should we say, genes created as body and mind? Well, no, not possible. No molecule could do that. And I think, to make a blunt point about it, I think for the last 80 years, roughly since the idea arose that the genetic material is a bit like a crystal, an ordered structure, and that all the order in biology came from order at the molecular level. That is a fundamental mistake. And that's what we've been living with the last 80 years.
Well, I'd like to explore that in a little more detail, if you don't mind. This other significant type of the coincidence of opposites, really, which is where order harnesses disorder.
Yes. Harnessing is the word. Yes.
So, Denis, in your field of genetics, you've demonstrated that rather than disorder being passively experienced by living organisms, which is the commonly accepted model, they in fact harness randomness, and they use it as a tool which can generate possible solutions to environmental challenges. So in other words, it's a sort of mutual dependence going on.
Indeed.
A polarity, if you like, of order and disorder. So would you just elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, one way I think to explain it to a general audience is that our bodies are doing this all the time. How did we react to the pandemic? A virus arrived. Now, of course, we made vaccines and so on, and that sort of saved a large number of people, and we're very grateful for that. But our bodies are doing the same thing. They are harnessing stochasticity all the time, chance, I mean. The disorder at the molecular level has to be corrected by cells themselves, but the living organism is what is responsible for it being possible for DNA to be transmitted from one generation to another. Now, that is done by correcting all of those errors, the disorder in the way that the molecular events occur. And it's corrected to an extraordinary degree, but it's under control. So if the organism needs to find a new way of attacking a new virus or a new bacterium, it will literally run down the error correction process so that millions, literally, of new DNA sequences are generated in order to create that kind of, the molecule that acts like a pair of pliers. It grabs hold of this new thing that's invading the organism. So this is not something we haven't known about for a long time. We've known about the immune system doing this for absolutely ages. Now you can go further. The brain does it too. There's massive disorder there too, at the molecular level, at the synaptic level, and so on. Now, the way I see it is that first, as I said earlier on, we wouldn't have creativity. We wouldn't have the creativity, we wouldn't have a Beethoven, we wouldn't have a Schubert, we wouldn't have an Einstein without there being creativity in living systems. But this is disorder that is controlled. That's the paradox. And this is a strange, well, I know you call it a symmetry, Red. It is the basic symmetry of between disorder and order, isn't it? And I understand Ian sort of resisting that and saying, well, that's not a symmetry. Well, in a sense, he's quite right. But at the same time, I think that's how the universe is. It has
it's
that
a sort of semantics, but there's a polarity going on. Perhaps.
Yes.
But anyway, so that's how the
you
universe
need
is.
both, and organisms live on the edge there. But I think the universe does too.
Well, Dimitra.
Interesting, yes. Well, I'm going to adopt a slightly more sort of physical term, and I would like to introduce the concept of entropy, which is what I would call this sort of disorder. And for us physicists, entropy is a very fundamental concept because entropy of the universe increases. And if you go back to the beginning of the universe, we are actually here because entropy increases and because it is allowed to increase. And even our life is very much the result of that, of the increasing entropy in the universe. Because if you think about it, if it wasn't for that, and if the universe didn't start at this very sort of quiet state and then, Big Bang, and then from there on, entropy increases continuously, we wouldn't be where we are today, right? It would be static, and at some point, it would just all stop. So life wouldn't be here. The sun wouldn't radiate energy, and Earth wouldn't absorb it and re-emit, dump the rest of it out in outer space. So a lot of these things wouldn't. Now, I think what you call perhaps this sort of disorder, I, as a physicist with my physics hat on, would call increasing entropy. And this is what you're saying, molecules and the very basic building blocks of the human being harnesses that to evolve.
Exactly.
And I would say that, yes, we are all here and the universe is what it is because this entropy increases, and living organisms, you may say, harness that, and the whole universe may harness that to sort of continue from the galaxies to the planets, to our own solar system. I think it is very much,
But this is a significant shift in thinking in a way, isn't it? Because traditionally we've seen order and disorder, or entropy and order, as being, well, maybe not as a physicist, but from the point of view of genetics, order and disorder seem to be somehow irreconcilable.
Unfortunately, yes.
The idea that they, in fact, not only form a mutual dependence, but actually they can feed off each other is really revolutionary. It turns your field of genetics absolutely on its head.
It does. But you see, the interesting thing is that Schrodinger understood what Dimitra just said. He says on page 101 of What is Life, published in 1942, which gave rise to the central dogma, which gave rise to the determinate idea and the idea that the genetic code was a kind of crystal. He says, well, but this is strange, isn't it? It can't be right. He knows he's got it wrong, but he can't resolve the difficulty. Now, the problem for Schrodinger way back in 80 years ago in 1942 is very simply that we did not know what the genetic molecule was. It wasn't known to be DNA then. People even thought it might be proteins themselves. But in any case, the fact is that he had the idea that somehow this was itself a self-correcting, a self-replicating, to use the selfish gene way of putting it, molecule. There are no such molecules, and certainly not in biological systems. First, the DNA does not exist as a crystal in living organisms. It cannot replicate like a crystal. That's the first point. It's actually a flexible thread, and it can be unwound at any moment when it's needed to be read, as it were, to be interpreted. That's the first point. Second, when Rosalind Franklin, who should have got the Nobel Prize with Watson and Crick, but that's another story. She was a woman, and I think there were big undertones there. But anyway, when she created the first crystallographic image of DNA, it was not a crystal. She actually managed to do it with a thread. That was the key piece of evidence that Watson and Crick used to generate their double helix explanation of the DNA code. So I think we can say that right from the very beginning of molecular genetics, we got something badly misunderstood. We thought that the lowest level of organization of the genetics in biology is ordered and like a crystal. And then we got it wrong in terms of how that can be, how the order can be created by the higher level of organization of living organisms. And that's where we went wrong.
Okay.